All right, let's get started. Holly's presentation slides are already on the schedule page in case you want to take a look at it later on. Usually. A reminder, the mini project is due pretty much exactly in 2 weeks. It's just before midnight 2 weeks from now, and again, groups of size exactly equal to 3. Make sure you get your groups in early enough. Email them to me. If you have emailed me your group and you do not hear back from me in say 2 days, send me a reminder. All right, so we were looking at the Gale-Shapley algorithm last time, and in particular we're starting to argue that it's correct. And so here's a quick reminder. I'll assume that you have this algorithm in your mind or written in your notes because I'll refer to it fairly often. But as a quick reminder, everyone to begin with, all the n men and women are free. Then you run this loop while there exists a free woman who can propose. Then you pick any free woman who has not proposed to everyone. Then that woman W picks the best man M that she has not proposed to yet. She then proposes, W proposes to M, and then M either gets engaged to W or not, depending on his preferences. Okay? And once this loop is done, the algorithm outputs the current set of engaged pairs as the final output. We'll make 2 observations. We've already made that before. Again, as I'd mentioned before, I'm not going to formally prove them, but these are great proofs by induction if you wanted to get some practice. So the first observation is looking at how W makes his decision on whom to get engaged to. You can then observe that once a man gets engaged, he remains engaged. And not only that, as if he gets engaged to another woman, then that woman would be higher on his preference list. Similarly, if you look at the algorithm from the perspective of the woman, and if the woman proposes to man M after M prime, then it necessarily has to be the case that she prefers M prime to M. Okay, so we're going to use these 2 observations. Again, we will not formally prove them. Good exercise for you to go back and do at home, but we're going to use them as given in our proofs. And last time we argued that the algorithm terminates, which is a crucial first step in proving that the algorithm works, because if your algorithm terminates, you cannot prove any correctness. And the way we did it was essentially via a notion of progress, where we track the number of proposals that are made at the end of round T or iteration T. So P of T is defined as the number of proposals that have been made by the end of iteration T. And then we observe that, well, the number of proposals is at least 1 because that's what happens at the end of the first round. And it's never more than n squared because that's the maximum number of pairs of men and women you can have. And finally, in each round, you have a new proposal that's made every time. So all of these together implies that the number of iterations at most n squared. So this is a bit stronger, not bit, very much stronger than saying it terminates. And we're going to use this later on when we do runtime analysis of the algorithm. So we're going to finish the proof today, hopefully today, that the output of the Gale-Shapley algorithm is indeed a stable matching. And we saw last time we'll do this via a sequence of 3 lemmas. The first one we proved last time, that is the algorithm terminates in at most n squared iterations. And today we're going to argue first that S is a perfect matching, and 2, that it has no instability. So remember, the definition of stable matching is perfect matching plus no instability. So the first one says the algorithm outputs some set S. The second and third lemma then argues that what's output is actually a stable matching. And that will prove that for on every instance, the output of the Gale-Shapley algorithm is indeed a stable match. Okay. Are there any questions while I set up the document camera? All right. So as a reminder, we are trying to prove lemma 2. which says that the output of the Gale-Shapley algorithm, which the output will denote by S, is a perfect matching. Before we go into the proof, I'm just going to restate the observations that I had made along with a couple of other things that we're going to use. Someone had asked, what does OBS stand for? It stands for observations, just shortened. Again, something that follows pretty easily from the definition of the algorithm is whatever's output is a matching. Right? You never assign one man two or more women, or a woman two or more men. Okay. The second observation is once a man gets engaged, he keeps on getting engaged to better women. And again here, the notion of better depends on his preference list. And of course, it also implies that once he gets engaged, he remains engaged throughout. The second observation is if W proposes to M after M prime, then it necessarily has to be the case that M prime is higher on W's preference list. So the other three observations, again, we are not going to prove them, but they follow from the algorithm statement. And I think I'd mentioned this last time. There's another lemma that we're going to use. This I'm going to prove, but in a while. Okay, so I'll just state this for the moment. And what this lemma says is, if at the end of an iteration, a woman W is free, then that implies W has not proposed to all men. All right, so again, the plan is I'm going to prove lemma 4 in a bit, but I'm going to use observation 0, 1, 2, lemma 4, all of these to prove lemma 2 and 3. Okay? Are there any questions? There are lots of lemmas floating around. Tyler? Yes. Yeah.
So it says in observation 2, if W proposes to M after M prime is greater than M. Why is it M prime is greater than M?
So greater here means it's higher on the preference list.
I think it's also.
So you're asking why is that?
Yes.
Okay, so if you look at the sequence of men that W proposes to, she will start off from a top of a list and keep on going down on a list, right? So if M prime is higher than that. I have to ask your name. Brian.
Are we assuming that number 4 is true here?
Right, so for now, let's assume it's true. We're going to use it to prove lemma 2. Once we prove lemma 2, I'm going to come back and prove lemma 4. And then we're going to go prove lemma 3. And then we'll finally be done. Okay. Any questions? I have to ask your name. Jared.
So it's okay to use something that's not judged.
Right, so again, that's what I'm saying. Trust me, we are going to prove lemma 4. So for now, let's assume it's true. I'm not going to leave it hanging. Okay. All right, so we're going to do proof of lemma 2. And as I mentioned, at least for the next few weeks, I'm going to divide everything into proof idea and proof details. So the proof idea here, and again, I mentioned this last time, the most common technique we're going to use in this course is proof by contradiction. So we're going to do proof by contradiction. And we're going to use, to come up with this contradiction, we're going to use observation 0, lemma 4, and also the algorithm definition. And again, as I mentioned last time, one of the warning signs that your proof is wrong if you're trying to prove correctness of your algorithm is if you do not use anything specific about the algorithm in your proof. Okay? All right. So this is the proof idea. Let's okay. So let's go through the details now. So I said we're going to do proof by contradiction. So what's the first step in a proof by contradiction? Yeah, so as Evan said, the first step in proof by contradiction is to assume the negation of what you want to prove. So here we want to prove S is a perfect matching. So we're going to assume that it's not a perfect matching. So assume for sake of contradiction that S is not a perfect matching. Now we're going to use observation 0, which says S is actually a matching, right? So if we know S is a matching and S is not a perfect matching, then that implies at least one man or woman is not assigned to anyone. Okay? So that implies by observation 0 and also the algorithm definition, so I'm going to shorten definition by this, is that there exists a free woman W. Okay. Because again, it's not a perfect matching, but a matching. So that means at least one of the women was not engaged. Okay. So that means W is free. Now we know by lemma 4 that if a woman is free, and now remember the algorithm has finished, so in particular it is at the end of an iteration. Since W is still free, that means she has not proposed to everyone yet. Yeah? So that implies by lemma 4, W has not proposed to all men. Any questions so far? Okay, so I have deduced two things. There is one free woman W, and that wait, did I mess up? Okay, that she has not proposed to all men. In particular, this implies there exists man M that W has not proposed to yet. And I denote it by star because I'll make use of this. All right, so with the assumption, assuming that S is not a perfect matching and using stuff that we know, we come up with the fact that there is a free woman W who has not proposed to some man M yet. Okay? Now we're going to use the fact that the algorithm has terminated, that it has output a solution here. Okay? So since algorithm has terminated, now would be a good time to look at your pseudocode and see that the condition of the loop is you keep on running the loop while there exists a free woman who has not proposed to all men. Right? Now the fact that there exists a free woman W and the algorithm has terminated, so this implies there is no free woman who has not proposed to all men. Okay, and again, this follows from condition of loop. And this directly contradicts this statement here. And I'm done. So talk to your friends for half a minute. Let me know if any questions. If not, I claim the proof of lemma 2 is done, assuming lemma 4 is correct, which we still have to prove. All right, are there any questions? So everyone okay with proof of lemma 2, assuming lemma 4 is correct? Okay. So we'll go on to prove lemma 4, but before we do that, I'll recall the pigeonhole principle for you. How many of you remember what the pigeonhole principle is and or actually went and did the reading assignment for last time? Okay, so I'm going to just state the lemma principle for you. Please do go ahead and read it up later on. So here's the pigeonhole principle. Actually, this is a fact or correct statement which is pretty trivial and should be very obvious, but turns out to be something that's very, very powerful and is very, very useful. Okay, so what this says is, if there are at most n-1 pigeons are put into n holes, then that implies there exists at least one empty hole. Okay, so all the holes are empty to begin with. There are n holes. You're trying to put in at most n-1 pigeons. You can stuff in more than one pigeon in one hole if you wanted to, but the point is, no matter how you assign pigeons to holes, there will be at least one empty hole left. Okay? So now let's so again, as a reminder, we're going to prove lemma 4, which says at the end of an iteration, if W is free, then it necessarily has to mean that she has not proposed to all men. Okay. So proof of lemma 4. Again, not surprisingly, it's by contradiction. So this is, so the proof idea is prove by contradiction. And here we're going to use the Pigeonhole Principle as well as observation 1, which, to remind you, says once a man gets engaged, he keeps on getting engaged to better and better women. And in particular, if he gets engaged at a certain point of time, he'll remain engaged for the rest of the algorithm. Okay. So let's work through the details. And again, as I said, the first step in a proof by contradiction is to assume the negation of what we want to prove. So what would be the negation of what we want to prove? Again, this is what we're trying to prove. I can wait. What is the negation of the statement that we're trying to prove? Alejandro?
If there's a free woman at the end, she already had proposed to every man.
Right. So the negation is, we're going to argue that you're at an end of iteration, a woman is free, but she has actually proposed to all men. Okay? All right. So, for sake of contradiction, assume there exists a free woman who has proposed to all men. Okay. Now this implies by observation 1 plus also the way that the algorithm is stated is that if a woman has proposed to all men, that when she proposed to the man, either the man was already engaged at that point of time, and that means at the end he will still remain engaged, or he was not, in which case he got engaged to woman W, but then again he remains engaged to the end. Right? So if a woman has proposed to all men, it necessarily has to follow that all the men are engaged. Okay? So this implies all n men are engaged. Okay? Now, what can you say about the number of women that are engaged at this point of time, given the fact that W is free? Can you put an upper bound of at most how many women can be engaged at this point of time? You can speak up more. N minus 1, right? Because we know at least one woman W is free. So in the worst case scenario, everyone else is engaged. Right? So, oops. Since W is free, this implies at most n minus 1 women are engaged. Now hopefully you already see the contradiction. I'm saying there are n men who are engaged, but then I'm saying there are at most n minus 1 women who are engaged. And that clearly cannot happen. And how do we argue this formally? This is where we use the pigeonhole principle. So this implies by the pigeonhole principle, where the holes correspond to men, the pigeons correspond to women, and an assignment of a pigeon to a hole corresponds to the pair being engaged. Okay. So again, since at most n minus 1 women are engaged, and for a woman to be engaged, she has to be engaged to a man. This implies there are at most n minus 1 men. So actually, let me note this as a separate entry. At most n minus men are engaged. But this contradicts this statement that we have already just talked about. So again, just to go over the argument is assume there is a free woman that has proposed to all men. That by observation 1 implies that all men are engaged. However, since W herself is free, there are at most n minus 1 engaged women in total. Since there are at most n minus 1 engaged women in total, by Pigeonhole Principle, that has to imply that there is at least one man who is not engaged, which means there are at most n minus 1 men who are engaged. And that directly contradicts the fact that, that we originally came up with, that all n men are engaged. Evan?
So why can't a woman be engaged to more than one man?
The question is, why can't a woman be engaged to more than one man? This just follows from the problem statement. That at any point of time, a woman is only engaged to one man, and a man is always engaged to one woman. Put another way, this is where you can use the observation that the output is a matching. So you're always maintaining the invariant that every woman is engaged to at most one man, and every man is engaged to at most one woman. Okay. Talk to your friends for half a minute. Let me know if you have any questions. If not, we'll move on to prove lemma 3, which says that there's no instability, and that will complete the proof that the output is a stable match. Are there any questions? Everyone okay with proof of lemma 4 and hence proof of lemma 2? And everyone okay with proof of lemma 1? Okay, so let's finish off the last remaining item on our agenda, which is we need to prove lemma 3. And as a reminder, lemma 3 just says S has no instability. Okay, so let's start off with the proof idea. Any guesses on what kind of proof technique we're going to use? Proof by contradiction. So we're going to do proof by contradiction. It turns out it's slightly more interesting because we're going to also use a case analysis with it. With a case analysis. And in particular, we're going to use observation 1, which says once a man gets engaged, he keeps on getting engaged to better and better women. Observation 2, which says if a woman proposes to a man M after M prime, then she prefers the earlier man to the later man. and by lemma 2, which basically says that the output is a perfect match. Okay. All right, so let's dive into the details. So note, we want to argue that S has no instability. We already know it's a perfect matching. So the contradiction is what? What should we assume for the sake of contradiction? S has an instability, right? So, by the way, as a hint, when I ask you a question, it's almost never a trick question. I'm probably going to ask you a trick question maybe once or twice in the entire semester, and it's not going to come before the midterm, so there's no need to feel like I'm trying to trick you or anything. If you think it's obvious, it's probably because it's obvious, right? So, okay. So assume S has an instability. Okay. Now note that S we already know is a perfect matching, right? So since by lemma 2 S is a perfect matching, the fact that S has an instability necessarily means the following has to be true. So which means we have a pair M comma W that's not matched, right? Because I can remember instability needed two things. It's a pair that is not matched and they prefer each other to their current assigned partners, right? So let's say M is assigned to W prime in S and M prime is assigned W, but M and W prefer each other. So what does this mean? This means two things. If you look at M's preference list, then he prefers W to his current assigned partners W prime in L of M. And this is important, and you need both parts. And M is higher than M prime in W's preference list. Okay? So this is what we can immediately conclude, knowing that the S is a perfect matching but not a stable matching. Okay? So now what we're going to do is a case analysis, and the case analysis will always contradict either this part or this part. Okay? So the question is, what should we do a case analysis on? And when you think about it, there's not that much happening in the loop, right? What happens in every loop? A free woman proposes, right? So one kind of natural thing to try to do a case analysis, and it works in this case, is to see whether W even proposed to M at some point or not, right? And so we're going to assume first that W never proposed to M, then come up with a contradiction. And then we're going to look at the other case that W never proposed to M and still come up with a contradiction. So case one, and this is W never proposed to M. Okay? But note that W is engaged to M prime. That means she has had to propose to M prime at a certain point of time. And she never proposed to M. That means she proposed to M prime at some point but never got down to proposing to M. Okay? So this implies by observation 2 that M prime but M prime comma W are engaged. So that implies W proposed to M prime. So since she proposed to M prime but never to M, it has to be the case that M prime is higher than M in L of W, but this contradicts the first assumption, the second one, which says that M is higher than M prime. Okay, so it is the case that if W never proposed to M, it was because she prefers her current assigned partner to M. Okay, and so that can't lead to an instability. So case 2 is slightly interesting, and we have to kind of look into 2 subcases. The second case is W does indeed had proposed to M. And now we again go back to the algorithm statement. What happened when W proposed to M? What did M do? It checked whether he was free or not. If he was, he got engaged to W. Otherwise, he checked who he was engaged to. Okay. All right. So the 2 subcases are, let's assume M decided to get engaged to W at that point of time. Okay. So let's say M comma W got engaged then. Okay. But note that M currently is engaged to W prime. So now we're going to whip up observation 1, which says, since at some point he was engaged to W some point in the past, but currently is engaged to W prime, by observation 1, this implies he prefers W prime to W. Okay. So this implies by observation 1 that W prime is higher than W in M's preference list, and this now contradicts the first thing that we know, that W, when we assume for the sake of contradiction, W prime had to be higher. W had to be higher than W prime. Okay. This is probably the most interesting case. It's not that hard. We just have to kind of work through it. Let's assume when W proposed to M, M was actually engaged to W double prime, were engaged, and the reason M and W did not get engaged was because man M preferred W double prime to W. So that's the only reason he won't have switched and gotten engaged to W. And again, so at some point he was engaged to this woman W prime, but currently he's engaged to W prime. Then again, by observation 1, he would prefer W prime to W double prime. Okay. So this implies by observation 1 that W double prime is higher, W prime is higher than W double prime in M's preference. Okay. So we've argued that in M's preference list, W double prime is higher than W, and W prime is higher than W double prime. So that has to mean W prime is higher than W in M's preference list. Okay. So this plus this implies W prime is higher than W in M's preference list, and this contradicts this guy. And that actually does it. So we've gone through all cases. In all cases, we came up with contradiction. So the only thing we had assumed was incorrect. Sorry, I went a bit over time. I'll see you guys on Wednesday.